I refrained from crying. I simply stopped experiencing any emotions. I knew deep down that Vincent wanted me to scream and cry, not because I didn't want to do either of those things. He desired the spectacle, the drama, and the tears. However, I refused to provide him with the gratification. Not right now. Never. Our downtown office's rooftop patio was alive with the excitement that follows receiving a significant gift. Like a tiny, cozy triumph in the center of a frigid world, it signifies that everything you've worked for has been validated. I took in all of the congratulations and applause from my colleagues as they raised their champagne glasses. This was more than simply a piece of paper, this was my title, my promotion. It served as a symbol, evidence that my time here had not been squandered. It had finally meant something after all those late evenings spent in front of my computer, missing birthdays and forfeiting weekends. However, it was short-lived, not at all. "To Kelly," Hannah exclaimed, raising her glass to celebrate. "My best friend from the company, from entry-level analyst to senior strategy director. You've more than earned it." I couldn't resist grinning. Around us, there were a few cheers, it seemed to. Excellent. As if I had created it. This was the reward for all the late nights, the tension, and the sacrifices. I was pleased of myself at the time because it was the kind of recognition I had always dreamed of. So proud. I noticed the familiar faces in the crowd. However, Vincent was the only one who drew my attention. My supervisor, the man who had been my mentor and the one who had recruited me. With a tight-lipped smile, he lifted his drink and turned away. Something seemed strange, but I wasn't sure if it was the booze, the late hour, or just the abrupt change in energy. It has been weeks since Vincent was the same. He had been chilly, even aloof. He used to compliment my leadership and intuition, but these days he hardly ever spoke to me. I initially believed it might just be stress. Given the difficult quarter we had, perhaps the board's pressure was the cause. However, I was no longer so certain. I wasn't going to let it spoil my evening, though. This was something I deserved. It was my time. Then Vincent got to his feet. The crowd became quiet as the music grew softer. Everybody turned to face him. He tapped a spoon against his glass and said, "Everyone, if I could have your attention for one final announcement." His voice cut like a razor through the air. Rising over the commotion, my stomach turned over. I ought to have been ready for this. However, I wasn't. The pause was long and purposeful. Too much time. I sensed that everyone was watching me. Although I had no idea what was going to happen, I knew it wouldn't be good. Then he turned to face me. There was that nasty smirk, hardly concealed, with a smug sense of pleasure. He said, "Kelly, you've had your celebration. Now it's time to say goodbye." A couple of gasps, a few whispers. Then the words appeared. "Your position is being terminated. Effective Friday." The air was heavy. Everything around me whirled. I parted my lips. However, nothing was said. I ought to have inquired why. I ought to have screamed. I ought to have pleaded. However, I didn't. I simply grinned. I answered, "No problem," sounding so flat that they seemed to float in midair. Vincent blinked. That was unexpected. His look showed it to me. He waited for me to cause trouble, to plead for my job, or to collapse. However, I didn't. I maintained my composure. "Cool Friday," I said. "I'll be out by the end of the day." I abruptly turned away, grabbed my glass, and sipped champagne once more. The music went on, but the room was no longer as lively. People started to go. Some apologized in hushed tones. Some simply vanished. I remained. The music continued long after it had ended, long after everyone else had gone. Because I had anticipated this. Something Vincent was unaware of and nobody else at that gathering knew. I overheard a talk a few weeks back that I shouldn't have. Vincent was unaware that I was in the adjacent room because it had been late at night. He had been discussing phasing me out over the phone, about the importance of optics, and that before they let me go, they would let me enjoy the celebration. He believed he was being shrewd. He was unaware that I had already begun to make advances, quiet ones that are strategic, and I had everything set up by the time he got up during my celebration to fire me. It was no longer about a job. Respect was at issue. regarding treachery, about being thrown away when you're no longer useful, and those who are like Vincent. The quiet ones are always undervalued. I sat at my desk the following morning, gazing at my computer screen as my inbox was stuffed with transition forms and HR documents. But it wasn't my main concern. I was preoccupied with my past actions, the steps I had taken in silence. Because there was no mic drop at the end of Vincent's story. No, I was more than simply a character in his already written script. It was going to be rewritten by me. Time was running out. However, what about Vincent? It was too late. It felt like Friday morning, distinct. As usual, the city awoke with the clamor of elevators opening and closing, the hum of traffic, and people hurrying for coffee. However, for me, it was different for me. Perhaps the storm was already here, waiting to break out. Or perhaps there was a sense of quiet before the storm. I dressed carefully. A black jacket and basic gold earrings, deep blue, the hue of peace before chaos, on a blouse. The sort of attire that exuded confidence. I felt the weight of the longer than normal elevator ride up to the 21st floor, which was like a constriction in my chest that would not go away. I have experienced this ride countless times. It always seemed like a routine part of the day. However, this time, I wasn't going to work this time. I had come to complete what I had begun. The silence struck me immediately as I entered the office. It wasn't the normal banter between cubicles or the sound of keyboards. No, this was not like the others. Despite the silence, you could sense the tension that pervaded the atmosphere. People avoided looking at me as if I were contagious, instead watching me out of the corner of their eyes. It didn't bother me. I had been here for too long, shrinking and doubting my value. No more. My fingers were moving with practiced accuracy as I sat down at my desk. After reviewing the HR forms in my mailbox, I accessed my personal drive. It was there, that document. The one I spent the last 2 months meticulously building. The one Vincent was unaware of. The kind that would make him regret ever betraying me. I hadn't gone seeking retribution. That would have been too untidy. No, I hadn't gotten involved in his affairs out of animosity. Perhaps it wasn't an accident, but it wasn't planned either. I was working through budget reallocations for the Singapore project 2 months prior when I became aware of an oddity. Large amounts were being channeled through shell vendors, and changes were being made. I didn't understand. I thus questioned Vincent about it. Just cutting costs, he said. Don't stress over it. However, I wasn't a moron. I could tell something wasn't right when he stated that. That tone was not new to me. It had the tone of just follow the script, don't ask questions, but I wasn't going to ignore it. I therefore performed what I do best. I made a record of it. Strategically, quietly. I checked invoices against each other, matched payment records, verified the addresses of the vendors. One of them identified their office as a Montana frozen yogurt store. Yes, making the connection didn't take long. Vincent has been using fictitious vendors to transfer money, raising prices, filling in the numbers, and I was the only one who had noticed. I didn't go up to him. Not quite yet. I called a lawyer first. I knew Teresa, a corporate whistleblower lawyer. In graduate school, she was intelligent and gave me precise instructions. Record everything, she said. Don't tip your hand, but make a trail. Not quite yet. So I did. The file was created by myself. Everything was stamped. I made 3 copies, one on a USB drive that never left my handbag, one printed and sealed in an envelope, and one stored in a secure cloud. And by the time Vincent got up to fire me at my promotion party, did he believe he had won by the time he announced? My finger was already on the trigger. He was completely unaware of it. I visited my former coffee shop across the street the day after the celebration. The place I used to go before work turned into a prison of squandered opportunities and late nights. Hannah was at a corner table waiting for me, her eyes worried and her face pallid. She hardly touched her sandwich as she murmured, "I still can't believe he did that. In public. As if you were a temporary employee who made a spreadsheet error." Without glancing at her, I stirred my coffee. Vincent has always been direct. She let out a sigh. However, why didn't you speak up? You simply grinned. Men like Vincent are more uneasy when there is silence than when there is anger. I stated in a calm, even voice. Her forehead furrowed as she gazed at me. Are you not preparing something? I gave a small smile. Just getting ready to leave. Ensuring that my home is organized. She arched an eyebrow. Want to know? I took one look out the window. Most likely not. However, you'll learn soon enough. I went back to work after lunch. Not a drama. No show. Just quiet accuracy. I printed out a neat, business-like transition report, complete with all the information they would require to continue operations following my departure. Passwords, important contacts, status updates, and every project I've worked on. Everything. It wasn't giving. It was a contrast. Because I wanted things to be apparent when the storm came. I had done it correctly. I didn't leave any mess. I didn't leave any evidence. They still decided to make me look bad. Quiet anxiety, whispers in the hallways, and the feeling that something significant was approaching characterized the remainder of the day, which flew by. It was building, like the air before a rainstorm, and I could feel it. I then got a calendar invite from HR at 3 p.m. It said last exit interview, 3 p.m. on Friday. A tidy little formality. What HR was unaware of was that by 3 p.m. rolled around, there would be doubts about the system itself. The fire would soon burst out because the fuse had been lighted. When the first sign appeared, I wasn't shocked. The time was 9:15 a.m., with a loud slam of the door that reverberated throughout the floor. Vincent ran out of his office. His jaw was tensed and his cheeks heated. Like a man who had just been caught with his hand in the cookie jar, he yelled something at his helper before vanishing into the stairway. I didn't have to inquire as to what transpired. I was aware beforehand. The board had received an anonymous tip 10 minutes prior. My fingerprints were all over the tip, yet nobody was able to identify me. It had been a secure, tidy email. Documents with a timestamp, a thorough audit trail. It was the sort of event that was impossible to overlook. Something that would cause Vincent to perspire profusely. He would be ruined by that type of tip. The power play was just as much of an issue as the financial malfeasance, the deception. He thought he had gotten away with humiliating me in this way. The job was no longer the main focus. Everything he had been concealing had to be revealed. I could sense the change by 10 in the morning. A new sort of tension, a subdued urgency, was in the air. Barbara, the general attorney, entered the building. Even though I had only seen her twice, I could tell by the expression on her face that Vincent was no longer in charge. He wasn't making decisions. Not right now. The first member of the legal team showed up about 10:30 a.m. They weren't there to check in casually. Their purpose was to look for anything that might link Vincent to the devastation he had created, and they had already begun gathering his belongings, gadgets, files, anything that could provide evidence of his actions. The murmurs started. It was silent at first, with murmured Slack communications. People were beginning to make connections, and I could sense the excitement building as they asked, "Why is legal here? What's going on with Vincent?" There was an anxious energy throughout the room. The automated text arrived at lunchtime. The report had been examined by the board. They had it. They also desired to meet. "Please do not leave the building before speaking with our committee representative." It read. I put my phone down and locked it. You don't have to respond. Everything they required was there. Vincent was not even aware that they were making progress at this point. My exit interview was scheduled for 2:30 p.m. The one I was given a week ago by Vincent. The one he expected. To be a low-key formality. The one for which he had no plans. Denise from HR was seated in the conference room when I opened the door. But she wasn't grinning this time. Beside her stood a tall man I had never seen before, dressed in a gray suit. Price. James, board internal counsel. I mean it. Quiet, observing me intently. "Kelly," he murmured as he stood. "I'm James Price, internal counsel for the board. I'd like to ask you a few questions before we proceed with your departure documentation." With a composed expression, I took a seat across from them. I folded my hands in my lap. Vincent had no intention of doing this departure interview. It was no longer just about me. He was the subject of this, regarding the reality. James took out a single sheet of paper from a folder. I had forwarded it to the board as one of the attachments. Color printing. A timestamp has been applied. Private. He wasted no time. He stated, "We've reviewed your report in a steady, even voice. What you provided is extensive." I gave a nod. It needed to be. Denise's fists were clasped in her lap as she sat motionless next to him. She didn't know how to proceed. She was aware that this was more than simply a job. This was larger, James went on. Several of the financial documents you included suggest serious breaches of fiduciary duty. Some could constitute fraud if verified. I didn't wince. They're already verified. Check the audit trail on our internal system. I made sure everything was timestamped and recorded. The files I sent weren't my opinion. They're the company's own records. He looked at me for a while, as if he was attempting to ascertain my desires. What do you want from this, Kelly? My hands were folded. I don't want anything. I'm leaving today. As planned. I have no interest in dragging this through the media or destroying the company. But if I hadn't spoken up, no one would have. And people like Vincent. They shouldn't get to crush careers for sport and walk away untouched. James gave a nod. After shutting the folder, he faced Denise. He remarked, "We appreciate your discretion. The board will begin an emergency investigation immediately. We've already placed a freeze on Vincent's financial authorizations, and we've begun a deeper audit. We'd like you to make yourself available for any follow-up questions over the next few weeks." Slinging my backpack over my shoulder, I got to my feet. You know where to find me. I left the conference room with a more collected gait than I had ever had. However, I wasn't the one shown the door this time. The truth had come out because I had opened it. The whispers ceased to be whispers by 4:00 p.m. It had been disclosed by an accounting employee. Vincent had been discreetly led out of the building through the parking garage, not by security. It wasn't intimate. Officially, it was. There was a lockdown on the executive floor. Legal was scuttling around his office, retrieving emails and gathering gadgets. The employees, they were humming. Although they were unaware of the specifics, they were certain that something had changed. Hannah moved into the seat beside me at the workplace cafe around 4:30 p.m. She had large eyes. "Vincent is no longer there," she muttered. Gone. They're wiping his email. No one's saying anything. But I know I didn't have to speak. I only glanced at her and she got it. "You knew." I gave a nod. "You asked me if I was planning something." She opened her mouth a little. "Holy Kelly, what did you do?" I gave a small smile, but it wasn't one of pride. I told the truth. I finished packing by 5:00 p.m. Not in a hurry, not in a cardboard box, not a drama, no show. The elevator is only a short, quiet walk away, and I sensed it when the doors shut behind me. Something had changed. Someone had lifted a weight. However, I heard a voice before the doors shut all the way. "Kelly, wait." I pivoted. "Barbara." The general attorney was there. With a folder in hand, she joined me in the elevator. "I wanted to catch you before you left," she replied. "The board's meeting late tonight. We're initiating a formal misconduct investigation into Vincent. What you provided is likely to trigger SEC reporting requirements." I remained silent, allowing the stillness to do the talking. She gave the packet to me. "This is a formal notice of whistleblower status. It protects you from retaliation. I know you're technically leaving, but if you ever want to return in any capacity." I put the folder in my backpack. "Thank you, but I think I've already outgrown this place." She grinned. "You're probably right." I stepped out into the refreshing evening air as the elevator opened. Behind me, I glanced at the glass skyscraper. I had poured 7 years of my life, energy, and ideas into that place. It had attempted to bury me with a party and a smile. However, I hadn't been laid to rest. Someone had planted me, and now the foundations of reality were beginning to show through. It wasn't finished yet. The storm had passed by the morning of Monday. From Slack to emails to whispers in the hallway, the news crept into the office like an unsaid whisper. At first, everything was quiet, the kind of thing that everyone knows deep down but doesn't discuss openly. Similar to a large object crushing down on the space. Although it wasn't required, the story didn't mention names. People already knew Vincent's face. They didn't need to see it. The wording was perfect. Financial action that is not allowed. Report from a whistleblower. A senior executive was put on administrative leave right away. That final section, that one was pleasant, because this was the moment that disproved Vincent's belief that he was untouchable. The office wasn't where I was. I was not required to be. I had left the building on Friday, when my contract finished. In a sense, though, even though I wasn't physically there, I was still a part of the story. The muttering were stronger by midday, like a wildfire tearing through parched grass. The office had gone from quiet and tense to frantic. People were beginning to understand how I was embarrassed during the party by Vincent. How did I not respond? How? Day after day, I continued to arrive there, composed and at ease. I was no longer alone. Everything was beginning to fall apart as the truth spread. I watched everything on my phone while I sat in my flat. The messages were pinging. My email was overflowing with LinkedIn notifications. Coworker whispers had turned into full-throated voices. "I regret not defending you sooner," one note said. "Your actions were courageous." Another, "I'd like to be involved in whatever you're planning next. I will no longer remain silent." However, one was distinct from the others. I hardly knew Erica from another department, but she sent it. Her letter struck me in a way I hadn't anticipated, even though we had only spoken briefly. "You don't know me, Kelly, but I've been Vincent's employee for 5 years. More times than I can remember." He claimed credit for my work. "I believed I was having hallucinations. I believed I was insane. However, what you did, it proved to me that I wasn't. Thank you." I gazed at her message for a while, allowing it to fully register. Then I just said, "You're not crazy. Simply put, you were in the incorrect system. Continue." Even though I was unaware of it at the time, I recognized then that this was no longer just about me. It had never been. All those who had been silenced were the subject of this. All of the people who the Vincents of the world had ignored, or excluded. Those who merely wanted to succeed in a workplace that treated them like trash and tried to perform decent work. And now, that system was breaking now. The board sent an internal memo on Tuesday. They admitted to significant oversight gaps in finances. They also gave names this time. In anticipation of additional legal review, Vincent had been formally fired. They used the phrase terminated instead of resigned. I didn't miss that distinction. It was a minor triumph, a little one. Even though no one else noticed, it was plenty to make me smile. That afternoon, Hannah gave me a call. She couldn't believe it. "Everything is being overhauled," she stated. "New rules, mandatory ethics training, and new systems for reviewing expenses, to examine vendor contracts. They have even hired a third-party company. It sounds like damage control." I shook my head and paced my apartment. I said, "It's damage control. However, it is real. This time, they're afraid. In fact, many are speaking up." This wasn't only about Vincent, even though I didn't say it aloud. It had to do with the system that had allowed him to continue getting away with it. It had to do with the fissures that had started to appear, and the hammer had struck me first. What's the best part? And I wasn't even done yet. I was already negotiating with 3 other corporations while Stratwell frantically tried to contain its mess. They had all reached out. They had all been impressed with my self-control. One of them, the up-and-coming consulting business Alira Partners, had been particularly keen. Naomi, the CEO, made a personal contact. "I could hear the unsaid understanding between us throughout our Zoom call," she remarked. "You never made it about revenge and maintained your composure during a takedown. That is uncommon." I had no desire for vengeance. Accountability was what I desired. Naomi saw that there was a distinction, I stated. I wasn't seeking retribution. I wanted to be held accountable. I could see the recognition in her eyes when she smiled. This is just what we need. For women in strategy roles, we have been subtly developing a leadership curriculum. I want you to assist in leading it. I signed a new contract by Thursday. Greater pay, a more important title, and a leadership role that truly mattered. Alira provided me with a platform to spearhead significant change, a private office, and a voice at the table. However, that Friday was the greatest part. It was precisely 1 week following my alleged promotion celebration. A formal press release was issued by Stratwell and Company. Not much. Not even close to what they owed me. However, it was open to the public. Everlasting. It said, "We are grateful for Kelly Harmon's significant contributions throughout her time at Stratwell and Company. Her dedication to accountability and moral principles has led to important organizational reforms that we will continue to uphold." I didn't deserve that apologies. However, it was a beginning, and Stratwell called my name for the first time in 7 years. Not as a figure, not as a last resort. However, as someone who had changed things. Even though I really wanted to hear those words, the comment didn't represent the true victory. It was in the subdued gratification that I had left that location with a proud ego and that Stratwell would always remember who I was. Because Vincent had ultimately turned me into the cautionary tale he had attempted to make me. But me. It was me who got up and demonstrated to them all how to change. And I had discovered my power in that transformation. It wasn't my final altercation, however. I battled for myself in the first one. And that's all that matters in the end. It wasn't the end. However, I sensed it, the silent kind of triumph. The kind you keep to yourself. Like something sacred. Rather than announcing with pyrotechnics, losing his work wasn't the only thing that contributed to Vincent's decline. It was about the aftermath. It discussed how things had begun to change and how many who had been hushed were now beginning to speak up. It has to do with me, but it was only one aspect of it. It had been a month since I had left Stratwell. Everything was calm. Every day felt like a fresh start when I signed the contract with Alira Partners. I played a different part. It wasn't just a title someone put on me to make me appear nice. It was real. Now, once I was seated at the table, it was the kind I had merited. However, I still occasionally thought about Vincent despite everything that had changed. With clarity, not with resentment. He was only a minor detail in a much larger tale. A tale of control, power, and those who believe they can destroy others simply because they can. Furthermore, the story was widely shared and wasn't simply his. I'd come to terms with it. However, I had also accepted that I would never forget what I had discovered. When the world tries to bring you down, it's the things that matter and keep you upright. Compliance, silence, and surrender were never the solution. They were the restraints that held someone like Vincent in check. However, I was no longer operating under those guidelines. I was looking out at the city skyline one evening while I sat in my new workplace. It was a different view. Concrete and glass were no longer the exclusive materials. It reflected all of the things I had battled for. I had rebuilt. Everything. I was distracted from my thoughts as the phone buzzed on my desk. Hannah had sent the email. She had been assisting me in acclimating to my new position at Alira. This time, though, it wasn't a work update. It was a news article link. When I clicked on it, the headline caught my attention. Vincent Simmons' financial misconduct, internal investigation, leads to major executive overhaul at Stratwell and Company. My heart wasn't pounding. I wasn't shocked. I had anticipated this. The brief clinical piece stated that Vincent had been placed on indefinite leave while he awaited legal proceedings and that he had been the subject of an inquiry for months. The portion that stood out to me was towards the conclusion. Stratwell's board of directors has announced a major internal overhaul, focusing on improving ethical oversight and transparency. Experts say this shift is long overdue and signals the company's willingness to rebuild after recent scandals. I grinned to myself. The things I had been fighting for were now being said. At last, they were acknowledging their mistakes. Even though it wasn't the kind of public apology I had hoped for, it was sufficient. It was a beginning, however. It wasn't the piece that struck me the most. It was the piece's final sentence. The company has acknowledged the critical role of its whistleblower in exposing the misconduct, and future leadership will be focused on accountability and transparency. It has nothing to do with me. Vincent wasn't even involved. It has to do with something more significant. It was about a broken system that now had the opportunity to mend, and I had contributed to that recovery. I sat for a while, allowing that to sink in. The feeling of familiarity, now different. Something more satisfying. Not the approval I had once sought. It was no longer about being noticed. I wanted to know that I had made the proper decision. The Stratwell board sent me an email later that week. Request for meeting, follow up on whistleblower. Report was the subject line. I was aware of it. They desired to see me. They wanted to discuss the adjustments they were doing and the procedures they were establishing to guarantee that something similar to what had happened to me would never occur again. I didn't have to meet with them, though. No more. I had fulfilled my obligation. The system was changing. Individuals were beginning to speak. Individuals were discovering their voices. And I wasn't only a character in the story for the first time. That had been written by me. I got to my feet, went to the window, and gazed down at the city. The same city that used to feel so unwelcoming and unconcerned about my suffering. It felt different now, as if it were mine, as if I had claimed it. I was no longer battling for a place at the table. I was constructing mine, and I had discovered a strength I was unaware I possessed in it. Doors were opening, and I was taking the next step. And now, nobody was going to stop me this time.